Thank you very much. We'll come back to that in a second. All right, Dr. Michael, why don't you wade into the question of, is this a cost of, are these worth it?
Yeah, my comments today are mostly going to be about economics, which is, as economists, I view as the answer to the question, are the tunnels good for California? I'm going to start with just a few comments about finance, which is a more narrow question of can we pay for it? Can the state be protected in these questions earlier? When the questions of finance come up regarding the tunnels, when the new water fix was announced, generally what you hear is a statement that the cost is $5 a month for Southern California households. Many of you may have heard that. So $60 a year per household served by Metropolitan Water District. That's presented as affordable. I don't know if whether all those households would be excited about that $60 a year, but it's certainly a financial lift that they're capable of doing. The problem is that $60 a year for metropolitan ratepayers only pays 25% of the tunnel's costs. And so it's sort of an incomplete answer. And the reason why that doesn't pay all the tunnel's costs is that the majority of the water exported from the Delta and the majority of the costs, at least as currently envisioned, would be paid by agricultural users. And so the question about whether the project is financially viable, at least in the current discussion, really has nothing to do with the $5 a month and has everything to do with whether agriculture can bear these costs. And then that goes beyond that, is it in their interest to bear those costs? Even if they can bear them, they may be made worse off by doing so. So the latest documents for the water fix, and you look at the water supply yields in the EIR, about 250,000 acre feet of water, two-thirds or so of that to agriculture. You may have enough additional water to irrigate 60,000 acres in the San Joaquin Valley. And we're concerned that San Joaquin Valley agriculture certainly is constrained and pressured by water availability. There's concern about the acreage shrinking in the future. If you want to keep it simple, just sort of think about how much agricultural land would the tunnels help keep in production in the San Joaquin Valley? And the answer is at about 3 feet per acre to irrigate crops, you're at about 60,000 acres. The upfront price tag allocated to farmers is about $10 billion. So simple division shows about $160,000 per acre would be the cost. That's multiples above the value of farmland in the San Joaquin Valley, even a great almond orchard with reliable water supply doesn't trade for anywhere near that amount. And worse yet, one of the financial problems with the tunnels are drought years like we're in today. And when you get into an extended drought and the tunnels aren't producing any additional water for the farmers, they're already financially constrained because they're paying more for the supplies that are available, or they've had to fallow some fields. And yet they have to come up with $1 billion a year or more, but $1 billion according to some of their consultants, in debt service payments, even in a drought like today. So that is not only a huge economic hardship on the Central Valley and those farmers, it raises serious questions about the financial viability of the project, and that's one of the key areas where you can expect taxpayers to have to step in and back the project or somebody. And I won't go on in this discussion, but in my view, the costs really don't make sense for farmers at all. That's why we haven't seen a complete financial plan from the project after 9 years. I don't see any way how it's viable without some sort of taxpayer subsidy or backing. Maybe they'll be creative with a financial plan, but I don't think that you can achieve that goal. Getting to the economic question, are the tunnels good for California? As you've heard, the tunnels are bad for the Delta region. Maybe a little bit less bad under the revisions under the water fix, but still not a good thing. They carry a lot of risks for the environment. They also carry risks for upstream water users. And so if you have a big project like this that's got some pretty severe negative impacts and risks on some parts of the state's consideration, and I think Craig did a good job of elaborating on that, sometimes it can still make sense for a state to move forward on a project like that. If the project has enormous, overwhelming economic benefits for the state as a whole and for the beneficiaries of it. There's an objective policy analysis process for looking at that question, and it's called benefit cost analysis. It's something that's taught in policy schools in economics. It's something that's elaborated fairly well in the Department of Water Resources' own guidelines that they've issued. And it's something that has been very late to arrive in the tunnels debate. If you think about benefit cost analysis, in some ways it's structured much like an environmental impact report. You're evaluating the benefits and costs of the project against a set of strong alternatives, not weak alternatives, and the option of no action. So the structure is similar to an environmental impact report. Some of what you've heard today is that the water fix and the process has not looked at an appropriate range of alternatives. I believe there are 15 alternatives in the EIR plan. 14 of them are different sizes and configuration of the isolated conveyance, and there was one alternative of enhanced through delta conveyance. There's a lot of alternatives out there. I've heard a number of iterations of the West Delta intakes diversion concept from a number of reputable people, including Mr. Wilson over time. That is an example of something, like the tunnels that you could come up with 14 different versions of and sort of optimize the configuration and the technology used. Similar effort should be placed towards those sorts of alternatives as well as others. But I'm aware of 2 cases, not highly publicized cases, where the state has looked at benefits and costs of alternatives to an isolated conveyance facility. First one was in some of the BDCP documents when it did look at what has been called the Delta Corridors Plan. So this is a plan that was got some people behind it a decade or so ago. You haven't heard a lot about it recently, but one version of the Delta Corridors Plan actually had a higher benefit cost analysis, a higher benefit cost ratio than the tunnels in the BDCP documents. We also know now that in the late 2000s and 2007, as part of the Delta Risk Management Strategy report, DWR did receive a consultant report that looked at a seismic levee investment strategy and compared it to, at that time, was an isolated surface conveyance that only cost under $5 billion, much less than the current possibility. That analysis, which was not released in the late 2000s, also showed that seismic levee upgrade had higher benefits and lower costs than the tunnels. But no effort was made to sort of optimize configurations of that scenario like has been made for the tunnels. And like I've said, there's a lot of other alternatives that haven't received any analysis at all, but what little analysis we do have shows that it's likely that other alternatives are better. Now, what I'm going to talk about now is compared to no action. I mean, a common thing that you hear is that, we have big problems in the Delta, we have to do something. It would be good to do something, but the formal analysis does compare things to no action and or the status quo. And economically, there's not even strong evidence that building tunnels is better than the status quo if we look at the benefits to the exporters. In fact, when I've looked at it using the documentation of it, I see just from the standpoint of the exporters about 30 cents of benefits to them for every dollar in costs that they're going to pay. And let's just run through some of them quickly. I mean, their reports show the water quality benefits that Craig discussed are worth a little bit less than $2 billion a year to the exporters. So that's a sizable benefit, not enough to justify a $15 billion project. The much talked about and earthquake scenario, the BDCP consultants valued that benefit at about $400 million because it's a fairly low probability scenario and a temporary interruption to water exports. One comparison that I've used is just to the current drought. I mean, we hear that the earthquake would, shut down the state's economy and sort of these dramatic proclamations, and so we need the tunnels. And it would be a costly shortage, but the tunnels, even in some of the worst case scenarios, might alleviate 3 million acre feet of water supplies. And if you look at something like the current drought, we're looking at 10 million acre feet of shortages, and it has had costs throughout the states, but the economy is growing quite well. And we know that some of these dramatic statements are a bit overplayed here. There's also some concerns about the impacts of that earthquake and what we need to do in the Delta itself. This would be a public safety, a humanitarian tragedy in the Delta, massive death and destruction. Just by my look at history, this would be and I've looked at the state's modeling of the event, it would be the highest mass casualty event since the 1906 earthquake, according to the state's study. So we have some serious, if there is a real significant risk of this, we need to think about other alternatives like levee upgrades that protect all these interests, both water exporters, lives, health and safety, and other valuable infrastructure in the Delta, which is often lost from an energy and transportation perspective. So you put the earthquake protection and the water quality benefits together, that justifies maybe 15% of the cost of the Delta, the tunnels from the standpoint of the water exporters. And really, so those are benefits to them, but really the economic viability of the tunnels has everything to do with water yield and water supply. The EIR, you need a tremendous boost to water supply to justify an investment of this cost. The EIR talks about a range of 0 to 500,000 acre feet on average. That comes nowhere near what is needed to justify a $15 billion investment, even when you account for the other things. If we just, again, just look at the, how much water supply you get for $1 billion investment, people talk about alternatives like desalination or dams, which are extremely controversial because of their, in large part because of their high costs. They're known as some of the highest cost alternatives. Per $1 billion investment, you get more water yield out of those projects than the tunnels. So there's some serious questions to that. And the final thing I'm going to talk about is the 50-year permit. I mean, these numbers I've talked about were out there a couple years ago. They're out there in 2013 when the BDCP made its proposal. There are questions about the economic viability then. And the state argued that it was still worth it, or the consultants did, because the 50-year permit, this sort of locked in this regulatory certainty so that the water contractors, this would put a cap on how much additional water or money they'd be expected to contribute to the endangered species issue. I thought at the time that they had sort of overestimated the value of that. I won't get into that. I mean, it's irrelevant now because they couldn't meet the environmental standards for that permit, and so that's been dropped. It has huge implications on the financial viability of the project and the value it provides to water exporters. Some of that's been discussed in the press. So in my view, there's, the state really, it's made some movement in a positive direction, but it still hasn't done really a proper benefit cost analysis from a statewide perspective, not just a water exporter perspective. I don't believe that there's evidence that the tunnels are economically justified even against the status quo, and I don't believe that there's evidence that they're better than the alternatives that are out there. And it looks, from my viewpoint, that the project's not financially feasible without a significant taxpayer subsidy for the financing. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I want to welcome Senator Hancock. And in the audience, I just noticed we have Supervisor Oscar Villegas from Yolo County, so welcome. All right, colleagues, if you have any questions, feel free to ask. I wanted to return to Dr. Swanson. I think when I left you, I was going to ask you, after your excellent presentation on the ecosystem, whether there were any particular alternatives that you think would be a better, would have a better impact and effect on the fisheries other than the current proposal.
Well, according to the best available science that we have on the system, and as I mentioned, this is an extremely well-studied system, the environmental variable that has the strongest relationship between to influence environmental conditions in fisheries populations is flow. And that's seasonal flows, and it's also interannual and within-season variability in flows. Scientists are really, the consensus is very, very strong that the most likely to be effective approach to improve ecosystem conditions and strengthen and begin to recover fish populations is to, compared to current conditions, enhance the freshwater flows in a very selective and a very functional way through the delta and into the estuary. It is by far the strongest variable. That is part of the reason that I think the Delta Reform Act's requirement that reliance on the delta as a water supply source should be reduced instead of increased. It was this recognition that, in fact, this is a system that needs more freshwater flow than it's getting. So that's number one. I certainly realize that that represents a conflict because, of course, we are using this system to provide water for other uses. On the other hand, from a scientific perspective, it's all a mass balance equation. I mean, we only get so much water out of this system on a year-to-year basis. We can modulate the variation a little bit with dams, but in fact, the supply in the watershed that goes through the delta is finite and it is variable. And it is most likely going to change in the future. So I think greater analysis should be applied to determine how much water the system needs, and there's a lot of good science out there which is making those suggestions, and in fact, the State Water Board is charged with determining that, and then that becomes the foundation upon which you can develop a project to export what is truly surplus to the system. Other factors, I think water quality improvements could enhance the ecosystem as well, and there are a number of projects that are already underway there, but in fact there are still big problems and big opportunities with regard to urban and agricultural runoff that could be better controlled. There are also some specific habitat restorations that, at least based on our scientific understanding, the system could be beneficial, and in particular I'll suggest floodplain restoration.
All right. I wanted to, first of all, I want to welcome Senator Pavley, who's just joined us, Chair of the Natural Resources and Water Committee. Welcome, friend. I wanted to follow up on something you said. First of all, the requirement, the scientific consensus around more flows would assist the fisheries. You also spoke to selective and functional application of those flows, or control of those flows, controlling of those flows. So that brings up the question, who decides and how is that decision made? So in the current structure of the State Water Project, how would those decisions be made? Because it sounds as if we're talking selective, functional, you're talking about variation over time, over a year, over a particular drought or not cycle, a particular rain cycle. So how are those decisions how would be what would optimize those, where is the locus of those decisions and who's involved in making them? And maybe we need.
Well, the first step is, of course, developing a flow regime which is intended to provide specific ecological conditions and conditions for species at the time they need them and at the levels that they need them. So the science is at the foundation. Certainly one of the places where those flows are managed are with minimum regulatory requirements for flows, and the current water quality control plan, in fact, does have different flow requirements at different seasons for different types of water years, wet versus dry years. Those standards are being reevaluated right now, as they should be, because I think we have pretty good evidence that they are insufficiently protective. The other approach that can be taken, which I know the BDCP before, and I do not know to what extent the California Water Fix espouses, is adaptive management. I would suggest to you that actually they're talking what is, in fact, more like real-time management, which is, well, we see some fish here, we'll turn down the pumps or we'll increase flows. That's different. Adaptive management is where you understand how the system functions, you identify an objective that you want to accomplish, you develop an action that you want to implement, you implement that action, and you monitor and see whether it works. I would argue that we've actually been doing that in this system, and that the Water Quality Control Plan standards represent an exercise in adaptive management, and based on our evaluation, I think it would be that this action that we took is insufficient. Protective, and then it's a good thing that they're evaluating that. I think this issue of who controls the valves and the pumps is certainly a big one. And having worked in the environmental community as a representative of that stakeholder group during, for example, the CalFed years, when in fact we were trying to do real-time management using such tools as the Environmental Water Account, my impression, based on my own experience, was that that was minimally effective, and that in fact there was regularly conflict between the fisheries agencies who have one objective and the water agencies and the exporter stakeholder community who have others. And particularly in recent years, and even in the latter years of CalFed and whatever came after CalFed, very, very frequently the recommendations of the scientists in the fisheries agencies were overridden by the water agencies, and recommended protections or changes in operations were not implemented. And that's even including in these most recent years. I mean, these past 2 years, essentially almost many of the most important minimal levels of environmental protection have been waived. So I think this issue of what do we mean by setting environmental standards and attempting to manage this system supposedly for these co-equal goals really needs to be very, very carefully scrutinized. I wanted to make one other comment, and it's a little bit off this topic, and that is that I've spoken on the basis of the science with regard to the ecosystem and the fish. But in fact, there's an equal body of very high quality science and technical understanding with regard to water management in this system. And one of the things that I think is very interesting that I'm going to suggest you give greater scrutiny to is to what extent this particular project, the Water Fix or the BDCP before it, actually really addresses the other objective of it, which is to improve water supply reliability in the system. And if you look at where we've been this past decade or more with 2 droughts, with these very, very large fluctuations in delta water, in the amounts of water that are exported for the delta, very large fluctuations. Those fluctuations are not being limited by conveyance. They're not being limited, they're not being driven by environmental protections. The largest component of the fluctuations in water exported from the delta are a function of hydrology and the fact that we have wet and dry conditions. And in particular, we see large drops in delta exports in the 2nd and 3rd years of a drought. That's the big problem that we should be looking to address with a California Water Fix. This is another example from my scientific perspective of essentially misidentifying what are the causal factors of the problem that we're trying to address. So I just wanted to make sure that that was out there.